There is a weapon you cannot see. No shrapnel, no bullet holes, just compliance. Budapest, 1949. Hungary is under Soviet control. The courtroom is cold. The air smells of stale tobacco and damp wool. Men adjust their coats and don't meet each other's eyes, because the verdict has already been written. The world is watching a man named Cardinal Józef Mindszenty. For decades, Mindszenty was a symbol of unshakable faith. He was the primate of Hungary, a man of iron will, a fierce critic of fascism who had stared down Nazis without blinking. He was the kind of man who would die before he would lie. He was a fortress. But the man standing in the dock is not that man. He is a husk. His eyes are glassy. They drift, then stop, as if the room has lost relevance. His skin is gray. He sways slightly, not weak, just not fully present. When he speaks, his voice is a monotone drone, devoid of inflection, devoid of defiance, devoid of life. He confesses to everything: treason, espionage, currency speculation. He implicates friends he had sworn to protect. He recites his crimes like a man reading a grocery list. At one point, he admits to plotting to steal the crown of St. Stephen to hand it over to the Americans. It is absurd. It is impossible. It is a fairy tale, but he says it. And he signs the confession with a hand that barely shakes. To the public watching the grainy newsreels in cinemas across America, he looked like a broken man. They assumed he'd been beaten, or starved, or simply ground down until the confession came out. But to American intelligence, watching from the shadows of Langley and Washington, it looked like something else entirely. No bruises, no scars. What they thought they were seeing was a demonstration of a different kind of control, something you could do to a man without leaving marks. In their reports, they used words like reprogramming, changing a reel of tape in a recorder. The fortress breached not by a battering ram, but by a key. And the question circulating in the hallways of American power wasn't, how do we stop this? It was, how can we do it better? Welcome to the Fairshake Files, a place where the official record ends and the real one begins. Tonight, we open the dossier on the most ambitious, the most unethical, and the most terrifying experiment in American history. A program where the battlefield wasn't a jungle or a desert, it was the human mind. One that turned elite universities into testing grounds, hospitals into prisons, and ordinary citizens into unwitting guinea pigs. It's a story that starts in conference rooms and ends in somebody's nervous system. This is the story of how the United States government decided that the Bill of Rights was a tactical disadvantage. This is the story of Project MKUltra, and this is Chapter 1, The Manchurian Question. To understand why a democracy would turn on its own citizens, we can't look at it from the perspective of 2026. We have to see it through the terrified eyes of 1950. We call it the golden age of capitalism. White picket fences, new Buicks, and rock and roll. But underneath that veneer, America was on edge. The world had just survived a war that killed 70 million people. And the peace that followed felt less like a victory and more like an intermission. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, years earlier than Washington believed possible. Suddenly, the monopoly on apocalypse was gone. Distance stopped feeling like protection. At the same time, China fell to communism. The most populous nation on Earth had turned red. In Washington, the men in charge, men who had just defeated Hitler, felt the ground shift. They didn't see these as separate events. They saw a pattern, and they assumed someone was drawing it. They believed the Soviets weren't just building better bombs, they were building a different kind of human being. They called it the new Soviet man, a citizen who was selfless, tireless, and utterly obedient to the state. A man who couldn't be bribed, couldn't be seduced, and couldn't be broken. American intelligence began to ask a question that haunts the archives to this day. What if the enemy has solved the equation of human nature? What if they have found a way to bypass free will? This wasn't just paranoia, it was an intellectual crisis. Western democracy is built on the idea of the individual, that every person is sovereign, rational, and fundamentally private inside their own head. But if the Mindszenty trial wasn't just theater, if a man's mind could be picked like a lock, then the whole premise collapses. This is the why. It wasn't sadism. It was the fear that choice, the whole Western model, could be engineered away. And then came Korea. If the Mindszenty trial was the theory, the Korean War was the proof. The Korean Peninsula, the forgotten war. But for the men fighting it, it was unforgettable. And for the intelligence agencies watching it was inexplicable. American GIs, young men from Iowa and Kansas and the Bronx, were being captured by Chinese and North Korean forces. They vanished into the camps along the Yalu River, disappearing into the snow and the silence. When they resurfaced, they weren't in uniform. They were on the radio, and they were saying things that were impossible. Take the case of Colonel Frank Schwabel. Schwabel was a Marine Corps aviator. He wasn't a grunt. He was an officer. He was a man trained to withstand pressure, a man who understood the chain of command and the code of conduct. He was the best of us. But in February 1953, Colonel Schwabel went on broadcast and confessed. He didn't just admit he'd been captured, he admitted to war crimes. He described dropping germ warfare canisters on civilian populations. He described the operation in intricate detail, the flight paths, the payloads, the targets. He sounded sincere. He sounded repentant. He sounded like a man unburdening his soul. "I want to get right with my God," he said. The United States government panicked. They knew the germ warfare program in Korea was a myth, but their own pilot, a man with a chest full of medals, was telling the world it was true. And he wasn't the only one. Hundreds of American POWs signed petitions demanding an end to the war. They wrote letters home praising the communist system. They denounced capitalism as a moral evil. They used terms like imperialist aggression and capitalist exploitation, phrases that weren't part of their normal vocabulary. They organized peace committees inside the prison camps. They studied Marx. When these soldiers were eventually released and came home during Operation Big Switch, the military doctors examined them. They stripped them down. They looked for the scars. They searched for the signs of physical torture, the pulled fingernails, the cigarette burns, the broken bones. But often, they found nothing. Physically, the men were intact. Mentally, they were gone. They were distant, confused. Some of them felt like strangers to their own families. They spoke in slogans. They seemed to be operating on a different frequency, as if someone had reached inside their heads and rewired the connections. The press needed a word for it. They got one from a man named Edward Hunter. Hunter was a journalist with a propaganda background, operating on the fringes of intelligence. He had been interviewing Chinese refugees, and he translated a colloquial term he kept hearing, "she now," literally, wash brain, brainwashing. It was a perfect word. It stuck. Industrial, clinical, and terrifying. To the American public, it explained the unexplainable. Why would an American POW turn on his country? He must have been washed. His mind must have been scrubbed clean and repainted red. It was a concept that fit neatly into the black and white world of the 1950s. But inside the CIA, the analysis was more cynical and more cold-blooded. They didn't just fear that the Soviets had a weapon. They feared that the Soviets had discovered a truth, that the human mind is soft clay, that loyalty is just a habit, that identity is fragile. And if the mind is soft clay, then the side that learns to sculpt it first wins history. Allan, the director of the CIA, looked at the reports from Korea and made a calculation. A cold, utilitarian one. If the enemy uses a tank, we build a tank. If the enemy uses a nuke, we build a nuke. If the enemy uses the mind, we must occupy the mind. There are two Americas in the record. In the public America, the one taught in civics class, the United States does not torture. The United States does not experiment on its own people. This is America as an idea. Rights first, restraint as strength, the moral high ground as a duty, the shield against tyranny. In the operational America, the one kept in burn bags, the one redacted with heavy black ink, the moral high ground is just a sniper's perch. It's a place you stand to get a better shot. On April 20th, 1950, the CIA approved its first secret program in this field. They didn't call it torture. They didn't call it mind control. They called it Project BLUEBIRD. The stated goal was defensive. It was written in the language of protection. The mission was to discover how the Soviets were interrogating captured Americans and to train agents to resist it. It sounds noble. It sounds necessary. We need to know what they're doing so we can save our boys. We need to build a shield for the American mind. But defensive programs in the intelligence world rarely stay defensive. Defense is passive. Defense means waiting to be hit. The agency was not built to wait. Once you build a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And once you build an interrogation room, you start looking for someone to sit in the chair. Within months, the agents running BLUEBIRD realized that defense was boring and slow. They didn't just want to know how to stop brainwashing. They wanted to know how to do it. The question was whether they could pull the same trick on a Soviet spy. Could they take a KGB agent, break him down, and create a double agent in a matter of hours? Could they take a loyal communist and turn him into an American patriot with a pill and a light? In August 1951, BLUEBIRD was renamed. It became Project ARTICHOKE. And with the new name came a new, darker mission statement. It wasn't about protection anymore. It was about control. A memo from January 1952 asked the question plainly. It's one of the most chilling sentences in American bureaucracy, stripping away the euphemisms and laying the intent bare on the table. It asked, "Can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against fundamental laws of nature, such as self-preservation?" Read that again. Against his will. Against self-preservation. They weren't looking for a truth serum. A truth serum just makes you talk. Alcohol makes you talk. Fatigue makes you talk. They were looking for a remote control for human beings. They wanted to create a man who would jump off a bridge if you told him to. A man who would kill his best friend if you gave the code word. A man who would betray everything he ever loved and believe it was his own idea. They were desperate. And under pressure, they got creative. They didn't just talk to doctors, they talked to magicians. The CIA hired John Mulholland, one of the most famous stage magicians of the era. They paid him to write a manual on deception. They wanted to know how to slip a pill into a drink without being seen. They wanted to know how to distract a subject's attention while you poisoned him. They wanted to know the mechanics of the trick. It was a surreal moment in history. The most powerful intelligence agency on Earth, taking lessons from a guy who did card tricks. But it shows you how far they were willing to go. They were looking for magic, because science wasn't moving fast enough. Project Artichoke sent teams of agents across Europe and Asia. They visited prisons in the American occupation zones in Germany. They visited safehouses in Japan. They were looking for discardable people, suspected double agents, refugees with no paperwork, deserters. People who, if they disappeared or lost their minds, would not be missed by a lawyer or a congressman. People who existed in the cracks of the world. They tested hypnosis. They tested shock. They tested isolation. They locked men in boxes for days, depriving them of light and sound, until their hallucinations became their reality, until the mind started to turn on itself out of boredom and terror. But they hit a wall. The human mind is resilient. It is evolutionary armor. You can break a man, yes. You can make him scream. You can make him cry. You can make him say whatever you want him to say to stop the pain. But you cannot make him believe it. As soon as the pain stops, the old personality comes back. The old loyalties return. The mind heals itself. The survival instinct kicks in. The agency needed something stronger. They needed something that didn't just hurt the mind, but dissolved it. They needed a chemical solvent for the soul. To find that solvent, they turned to the new gods of the 1950s, the chemists. This was the era of better living through chemistry. We had conquered polio. We had split the atom. We had invented plastic. There was a genuine, almost religious belief that there was no problem, physical, mental, or political, that couldn't be solved with the right molecule. And in a quiet, sterile laboratory in Switzerland, they found the molecule they were looking for. Dr. Albert Hofmann, a chemist at Sandoz Laboratories, had been working with a compound derived from ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and has caused madness and visions in peasants for centuries. 5 years earlier, on a spring day in 1943, he had accidentally absorbed a tiny amount of a synthesized version through his fingertips. As he rode his bicycle home, the cobblestones began to breathe. The trees began to vibrate. The world began to melt. He described seeing an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. He felt a sense of oneness with the universe, a dissolution of the self, a spiritual awakening. He called it lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD-25. To the counterculture of the 1960s, LSD would be a sacrament, a gateway to peace, love, and expanded consciousness. It would be the fuel for a revolution of the spirit. But to the men of the CIA in the early 1950s, reading the scientific journals in their windowless offices, it didn't look like peace. It looked like a weapon. They didn't see oneness. They saw vulnerability. They read the reports. They saw that LSD could induce a state of temporary psychosis. It could make a subject confused, suggestible, terrified, or ecstatic. It shattered the ego. It dissolved the barrier between the conscious and the subconscious. It took the guard dog of the mind and put it to sleep. And most importantly, it was colorless, odorless, and tasteless. and it worked in microscopic amounts. A speck the size of a grain of salt could incapacitate a grown man for 12 hours. You could slip it into a glass of water at a diplomatic reception. You could put it on a postage stamp. You could spray it in a room. You could dose a general before a speech, or a spy before an interrogation. The CIA decided this was the key. They believed this drug was the secret the Soviets were using. They were wrong, of course. The Soviets relied on good old-fashioned brutality, sleep deprivation, isolation, and relentless interrogation. They didn't need fancy drugs. They had the gulag. But the CIA projected their own fascination onto their enemy. They convinced themselves that the Soviets were using LSD, so they had to master it first. Dulles bought up the LSD supply. He wanted a monopoly on madness. He brought it back to the United States. He had the drug. He had the funding. He had the mandate. But he had a problem. He didn't have a scientist crazy enough to use it the way he wanted. The scientific establishment in America was bound by ethics. The Nuremberg Code, established after the horrors of Nazi medical experiments, was supposed to be the law of the land. It was the line that civilization had drawn in the sand. It stated, unequivocally, that you cannot experiment on a human being without their voluntary, informed consent. Dulles didn't want consent. Consent ruins the experiment. If you tell a man, "I am going to give you a drug that will make you crazy," his defenses go up. He braces himself. He rationalizes the experience. To know if the weapon worked, they needed to use it on people who didn't know they were in a war. They needed the element of surprise. They needed to see what happens when reality crumbles without warning. Dulles needed a man who didn't care about the Hippocratic Oath. He needed a man who saw human beings not as patients, but as petri dishes. He needed a poisoner. In 1953, the preliminary programs, BLUEBIRD and ARTICHOKE, were deemed insufficient. The threat was too big. The ambition was too high. The bureaucracy was too slow. On April 13, 1953, Allan Dulles sat at his desk and signed a piece of paper that would change the course of American history. He approved a new, super-secret umbrella project. It was designed to bypass standard oversight. It was designed to bypass the medical establishment. It was designed to bypass the law. It would be known by the cryptonym MKUltra. The MK digraph indicated it was sponsored by the technical services staff. The Ultra designation marked it as the highest level of secrecy, eyes only. But a program is just paper until you put a man in charge. Dulles found his man in the bowels of the agency's technical services staff. His name was Sidney Gottlieb. If you met Sidney Gottlieb at a party, you would never guess he was the CIA's chief poisoner. You would think he was a quirky academic or a gentle farmer. He was a mass of contradictions. He was born with a club foot that required multiple surgeries and left him with a permanent limp. He was rejected by the Army during World War II because of it, a rejection that fueled a lifelong, burning need to prove his patriotism. He felt he owed the country a debt. He was a stutterer in his youth who overcame it to become a smooth, soft-spoken talker. He lived in a farmhouse in Virginia, far from the Georgetown cocktail circuit. He raised goats. He drank their unpasteurized milk every morning. He grew Christmas trees to sell to the neighbors. He loved folk dancing. He got up early to meditate. He read Buddhist philosophy. He looked like a hippie before hippies existed. But inside his mind, there was a cold, hard detachment. And inside his carry-on luggage, when he traveled for the agency, he carried a black doctor's bag. It wasn't filled with stethoscope and aspirin. It was filled with vials of typhoid, botulism, and potent hallucinogens. Sidney Gottlieb had a very specific philosophy. He believed that the United States was in a battle for survival against a godless enemy. And in a battle for survival, there are no rules. There are no ethics. There are only winners and losers. He believed that to save democracy, he had to violate everything democracy stood for. He was willing to be the sinner so that America could be the saint. He was willing to damn his own soul for the sake of the state. He became the Black Sorcerer of the CIA. Under his direction, MKUltra would grow into a hydra. He would fund research at Harvard, Stanford, and Princeton, using front foundations to hide the source of the money. He would turn prison wards into torture chambers. He would set up brothels in San Francisco to drug unsuspecting men and watch them through two-way mirrors, taking notes on their sexual deviance while their minds melted. He would create a legacy of pain that would last for decades. But in 1953, as he accepted the assignment, he didn't see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a pioneer. He believed he was going to find the limits of the human mind and then push past them. It didn't take long for the experiments to begin. But they didn't start with enemies of the state. They didn't start with Soviet spies. They started with the people closest to them. Gottlieb and his team began to dose each other. It became a twisted game inside the technical services staff. You would come into work, pour a cup of coffee, and wonder if the walls were about to start breathing. They called it tripping. They would take LSD and then try to conduct meetings. They would take it and try to write reports. They would record each other's giggles and terrors. They thought it was funny. They thought it was research. It was a fraternity prank with weapons-grade chemicals. But then, they decided to expand the circle. They started dosing people who hadn't volunteered. They dosed CIA colleagues at retreats. They dosed military officers. And one of those officers was a man named Frank Olson. Frank Olson was not a spy. He was a scientist, a bacteriologist for the Army at Fort Detrick. He was a family man, a father, a man who had spent his career studying germs and biological weapons, but who had lately begun to have doubts about the morality of his work. He was a man with a conscience in a world that demanded silence. In November 1953, Olson attended a retreat at a rustic cabin in Deep Creek Lake, Maryland. It was supposed to be a bonding session between the CIA and the Army scientists. A few days in the woods to talk strategy and relax. They sat around a fireplace. They drank Cointreau. Sidney Gottlieb was there, and Sidney Gottlieb had brought his special supply. He slipped a massive dose of LSD into the bottle. 20 minutes later, the men started to feel strange. They were laughing uncontrollably. They were confused. The room started to warp. And then Gottlieb told them, with a smirk, "I spiked the drink." For most of the men, it was a bad night. A night of confusion and weird lights. But for Frank Olson, it was a descent into hell. Olson didn't just have a bad trip. The drug cracked him open. It took all his suppressed guilt, all his fears about his work, and magnified them 1,000 times. He became paranoid. He became convinced that the CIA was trying to humiliate him. He became convinced that he had made a terrible mistake in his life. He saw the germs he had cultivated. He saw the faces of the people who might die from them. When the drug wore off, the paranoia didn't leave. The door that had been opened wouldn't close. He went home to his wife, but he was a broken man. He told her he had made a terrible mistake. He wanted to quit. He wanted to hide. He was trembling. Gottlieb saw a problem. Olson was unstable, and Olson knew too much. He knew about the biological weapons. He knew about the terminal experiments in Europe. He held the keys to the kingdom's darkest closets. And now, he was talking about conscience. The CIA didn't send him to a hospital. They didn't send him to a psychiatrist who could help him integrate the experience. They sent him to New York City, to a doctor named Harold Abramson. Abramson wasn't a psychiatrist. He was an allergist. But he was on the CIA payroll. He was one of Gottlieb's men. He gave Olson more drugs, bourbon and chloral hydrate, a depressant to mix with the aftershocks of the hallucinogen. It was a chemical cocktail designed to sedate, not to heal. They checked into the Statler Hotel in Manhattan, room 1018A. It was a cold night in November. Olson called his wife. He told her he was coming home the next day. He sounded better. He sounded like he was ready to rebuild. But he never made it home. At 2:30 a.m. on November 28, 1953, Frank Olson went through a window. He crashed through the glass, the blind and curtain still wrapped around him like a shroud, and fell 13 stories to the sidewalk on 7th Avenue. He died instantly. The police arrived. The CIA handler in the room, Robert Lashbrook, told them a story. He said Olson simply woke up, ran across the room, and jumped. They called it a suicide. Work-related stress. The CIA called it a tragedy. His family was told he fell or jumped. They were given a closed casket. They were told not to ask questions. For 40 years, the Olson family lived with the lie. They believed their father had cracked under pressure. They believed he had abandoned them. It wasn't until decades later, when the files were opened, that they learned the truth. They learned about the cabin. They learned about the Cointreau. They learned about the LSD. They learned that their father hadn't lost his mind. It had been stolen from him. Frank Olson was the first American casualty of MKUltra, but he wouldn't be the last. His death taught Sidney Gottlieb a lesson, but it wasn't the lesson you might expect. He didn't learn that the experiments were dangerous. He didn't learn that dosing people without consent was immoral. He learned that dosing important people was risky. If a CIA agent or an Army scientist jumps out a window, there are questions. There are investigations. There are widows who call congressmen. There are police reports. So Gottlieb made a decision. He would move the experiments away from the agency. He would move them into the shadows. He would stop targeting his peers. He would target people who didn't have security clearances, people who didn't have power, people who, if they started screaming about government plots and mind control, would be dismissed as crazy. He would target prisoners, addicts, prostitutes, mental patients. He would target the expendable citizens of the United States, and he would do it with a budget that was virtually unlimited and oversight that was non-existent. The Manchurian question had birthed a Manchurian reality. The United States set out to find a way to protect the human mind from manipulation, and in the process, they built a machine designed to destroy it. They started with a fear of what the enemy could do, and they ended up doing it to themselves. Cardinal Mindszenty was the warning. Frank Olson was the collateral damage. But the real horror was just beginning. Because Sidney Gottlieb was just getting started. He had his chemist's degree, he had his poison, and he had his mandate. He was about to turn America into a vast, invisible laboratory. In the next chapter, we walk through the front door of that laboratory. We will travel to the jazz clubs of San Francisco and the brothels of Greenwich Village. We will meet the Whitey Bulger connection. We will meet the man who ran the safehouses, and we will see just how dark the machinery becomes when the lights go out. Join us for Chapter 2, The Two-Way Mirror. San Francisco, 1955. From the top of Telegraph Hill, the city looks like an invitation. Fog drifts through the bay like breath. The Golden Gate Bridge cuts a red line through the gray. Jazz clubs in North Beach are waking up. Neon signs flicker to life. A city built for reinvention. People come here to disappear. People come here to be someone else. And one of those people is a man calling himself Morgan Hall. If you met Morgan Hall at a bar in the Tenderloin, you'd remember him. He's bald. Under the lights, his head glints. His face looks like granite left out in the rain. He drinks martinis like they're water. He laughs too loud. He tells stories about gangsters and war, stories that make the table go quiet for a second, before everyone pretends it didn't. Then he invites you back to his place, a bachelor pad on Chestnut Street. He says he has a view you have to see. He says the party is just getting started. You trust him. He has that kind of force, the gravity of a man who owns the space he stands in. So you go. You climb the hill. You enter the building. You walk into an apartment that smells of cheap perfume. There are French posters on the wall. Red velvet drapes block out the sun. The place is staged to feel like you've wandered out of Eisenhower's America and into a private world where the normal rules don't apply. And then you notice something else. Among the art, there's a photograph that doesn't belong. A Japanese soldier. A face caught in a moment you can't place. You ask Morgan about it. He smiles. Not warm, not joking, just flat. He tells you he strangled that man to death in the war, and that he keeps the photo there to watch over him. You laugh. It's what people do when silence would be worse. You file it under bad taste, dark humor, war stories sharpened for a barroom audience. But Morgan Hall doesn't make jokes. His real name is George Hunter White. He is a federal narcotics agent, and he is working for the CIA. You are not a guest. You are being handled. And behind the mirror on the bedroom wall, the United States government is watching. Welcome back to the Fairshake Files. This is Chapter 2, The Two-Way Mirror. To understand what happened in San Francisco, you have to understand the strange partnership that made it possible. Sidney Gottlieb lived in the abstract. He thought in systems, in risk, in survival. He could justify almost anything if the enemy felt large enough. George Hunter White lived in the concrete. He believed in force, in leverage, in humiliation, in taking what you wanted and writing it up as enforcement. On paper, they should have hated each other. In practice, they completed each other. Gottlieb was building a program that needed real-world conditions, not clinics, not charts, not doctors taking pulses. He needed operational mess, surprise, confusion. The moment when a person's reality breaks without warning. White could provide that. And he could provide something else. Distance. White wasn't CIA. He was a cutout. A man whose badge could hide the hand behind it. A man who could run an operation in a city apartment. And if something went wrong, the blame would land anywhere but the agency. That mattered, because the CIA wasn't supposed to run domestic operations. Narcotics work gave White a legal reason to live around the underworld, and a convenient reason for the agency to pretend it wasn't there. White was already a legend in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, an old-school Fed with a World War II past that blurred into OSS work. The kind of bureau lore that travels in half-quiet warnings and half-admiring jokes, always a little louder after a few drinks. He didn't care about ethics. He cared about power, and he loved the hunt. White later wrote Gottlieb a letter that historians still hesitate to repeat because it's too naked. It's the voice of the program stripped of euphemism. A confession dressed up as entitlement. He described a world where a red-blooded American boy could lie, kill, cheat, steal, and pillage with the approval and blessing of what he called the All-Highest. And that year, Gottlieb gave him the place where it could be done. The operation began in New York, but New York was noisy. Too many eyes, too many headlines waiting to happen. San Francisco was different. A port city, a transient city, a city that looked the other way. In 1955, the operation moved west. It had a name that sounded like a smirk. Operation Midnight Climax. George White moved into a duplex at 225 Chestnut Street. But he didn't build the trap alone. The CIA brought in a professional criminal to design the stage. His name was Pierre Lafitte, a special employee, which is the agency's polite term for a con man with a resume. Lafitte filled the apartment with signals, Toulouse-Lautrec prints, brothel glamour, underworld chic. A library stocked not with literature, but with material so graphic, a visiting CIA agent later called it the most pornographic collection I have ever seen. The intent wasn't art, it was atmosphere. The goal was to make a man feel like he'd stepped into a permissive world where his choices didn't count against him. Then came the most important renovation, a two-way mirror in the master bedroom. To the guest, it was just a mirror, a place to adjust your shirt, a chance to catch your own eyes for a second and decide you're still in control. But on the other side, it was a window. Behind the wall was a cramped closet, a surveillance post. White drilled holes for microphones. He wired the apartment for sound. The wires ran back to a reel-to-reel recorder, and inside that closet, George White set up shop. Not a chair, not a desk, a portable chemical toilet, a mini fridge stocked with gin. This is the image that matters, not James Bond, not espionage glamour. George Hunter White, sweating in a dark closet, sitting on his throne, sipping a martini, listening to a hidden microphone while strangers' lives come apart on the other side of the glass. He didn't just observe, he enjoyed it. And this wasn't a rogue circus run on the side. The expenses, the toilet, the liquor, the rent, were approved through CIA channels for years. Gottlieb personally visited the Safehouse. The drugs came from the agency. White was not off script. He was the script, wearing a different badge. But a voyeur needs something to watch. White couldn't just drag men off the street. That attracts attention. That creates reports. That invites problems. He needed people to come willingly and to leave quietly. He needed bait that would keep its own mouth shut. He needed sex. White went to the Tenderloin, the clubs, the bars, the places where the city's promises often ended. He looked for women who were already surviving on the edge. Sex workers, addicts, women who were used to negotiating danger and humiliation as a daily cost of staying alive. He didn't recruit them as partners. He used them as tools. White's deputy was Ira Ike Feldman, an ex-cop who posed as a pimp. Feldman handled the street, the pressure, the offers that weren't really offers. The deal wasn't complicated. Bring men to the apartment and you get paid. Cash, protection, sometimes drugs. White paid with heroin and marijuana seized from other busts. Evidence became currency. The women were kept on a short leash, coerced, leveraged, controlled. The men were the targets. The women were the delivery system. The procedure was mechanical. A woman brings a man to the apartment. He thinks he's lucky. She goes to the kitchen to make drinks. The drink is already prepared. Sometimes it's LSD. Sometimes it's something else. Gottlieb and White tested whatever they could get their hands on. Marijuana mixed with tobacco, vasodilators that caused extreme physical distress, even a supposed aphrodisiac meant to chemically induce desire. The man takes a sip, and the clock starts. This isn't a recreational trip. There is no warning, no preparation, no consent, no context to frame what's happening. 20 minutes later, reality starts to fracture. In the apartment, the shift tends to start as confusion before it becomes terror. A sense that something is wrong, but you can't name it. The colors in a poster feel too loud. The shadows feel too close. Words don't land correctly. Your own thoughts don't line up in the usual order. He tries to speak and hears his own voice come out strange, like it belongs to someone else. He looks at the woman and can't quite read her face anymore. He feels his heart kick. He tries to stand. His legs disagree. He doesn't think, I've been drugged. He thinks, I'm dying. Or worse, I'm losing my mind. And all the while, the reel-to-reel recorder spins in the closet. White takes notes like an amateur scientist watching an insect in a jar. Subject appears confused. Subject crying. Subject curled in fetal position. Then the man stumbles out into the night, back onto the street, back into a city that keeps moving. No follow-up, no warning, no help. When asked later if he ever checked on victims after they left, Feldman laughed. He said he never did any follow-up. You don't give them a tip, you back away and let them worry. Let them worry. That was the policy. And for some people, the worry never ended. Here's the part most listeners want to skip past, because it's more comfortable if the victims stay anonymous. It's easy to call them subjects, a label in a folder, a line in a report. But they were human beings, names, careers, families, lives that were supposed to be ordinary. Wayne Ritchie was a deputy United States Marshal, not a drifter, not a man looking for trouble, a federal officer. December 20th, 1957. The Federal Building in San Francisco. A Christmas party. The room is full of smoke and laughter. Secretaries in holiday dresses, judges, cops. The familiar warmth of institutional belonging. The kind of night where you think you're safe because everyone around you is official. George White is there, as always, holding court like he owns the room. Ritchie sets his drink down while he talks to a colleague. He doesn't see the hand pause above it. He picks the glass up. He drinks. Whatever was in that glass, and all evidence points to a massive dose of LSD, lands like a trap door opening beneath him. Ritchie later describes it in a way that matters. It isn't trippy. It isn't colorful. It isn't psychedelic poetry. It's a cognitive collapse. Nothing becomes magical. The room turns hostile. Laughter degrades into noise, a roar, something mechanical, something cruel. Faces don't simply distort. They become unreadable, untrustworthy, like masks that have slipped. And the thought arrives fully formed, absolute, impossible to argue with. They are against me. Everyone here is against me. This is paranoia, but from the inside, it doesn't feel like paranoia. It feels like clarity. Ritchie runs. He bolts down the hall to his office. He is a deputy marshal. He has access to weapons. He opens his locker. He removes 2 service revolvers. He loads them. His mind is coming apart. His training does not. He goes down to the parking garage. He gets into his car. He drives into the city with 2 guns beside him. Imagine that for a moment. San Francisco, 1957. Reality unhooking from its hinges. Streetlights trail like comets. The grid becomes a maze. The city feels staged, like a set built for your ruin. Richie ends up at a bar. He walks in. He pulls the guns. He demands cash. Not because he needs it, because he is no longer operating inside his own story. The patrons scream. Police arrive. It is a miracle he doesn't kill anyone. It is a miracle the police don't kill him. They wrestle him down. The drugs wear off. The hallucination ends, but the damage does not. Wayne Ritchie is charged with armed robbery. He resigns in disgrace. He pleads guilty to a lesser charge to avoid prison. He loses his badge. He loses his career. He loses his name. For 42 years, he blames himself. He believes he snapped, that he couldn't handle his liquor, that he was weak, that something rotten in him finally surfaced. He paints houses. He carries the shame like a sentence. He never knows the crime scene was a Christmas party. No one ever tells him Feldman later called him a nitwit who deserved to suffer. No one ever tells him he was collateral damage in an experiment he didn't know existed. Meanwhile, inside the CIA, Sidney Gottlieb was working under pressure. You see, in the Cold War, the agency treated time like an enemy. Soviet and Chinese programs were rumored to be pushing their own versions of psychological control. And the fear wasn't just that it was happening. It was that the United States was falling behind. Gottlieb wasn't chasing one breakthrough. No, Gottlieb was trying to build a system. That system meant solving 2 constraints at the same time: the outside world and repetition. The outside world was messy. It meant administering a drug to someone who hadn't agreed to be part of anything, quietly and routinely, without drawing attention, and without leaving a clear moment anyone could later point to. Repetition was harder. Research, real or imagined, demanded volume. Trials you could repeat, subjects you could return to again and again. Same ambition, different conditions. So Gottlieb built solutions for both. For the first one, he looked beyond medicine, to people who understood the mechanics of focus. John Mulholland was one of the most respected magicians of his era. Not a novelty act, and not a performer chasing applause, but a technician of misdirection. Someone who understood how the human gaze can be steered, and how much people miss while they think they're watching. Gottlieb hired him to write a manual. Not a theoretical one, a real document, classified, methodical, and written for field use. Mulholland wrote for operators, not audiences. He wrote about perception, habit, and the blind spots built into ordinary routines. The moments people stop noticing because everything feels normal. The offered light, the brief distraction. The half-second your mind looks away and decides nothing happened. The point wasn't cleverness. It wasn't speed. It was deniability. Mulholland solved the first part, how to act without creating a scene. And once you can do that, you're no longer limited to volunteers or controlled settings. You can reach people where they live, and they may never know when anything changed. But deniable dosing only solves part of the problem. And that brings us to the second solution. A prison doesn't need misdirection. It doesn't need deniability. It already has total control. Inside a prison, repetition is built into the architecture. The subject doesn't choose the setting, doesn't choose the timing, doesn't choose when it ends. and that made it useful. In 1957, MKUltra expanded into the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, a closed federal system where access was guaranteed and compliance could be described as cooperation. One of the men inside was James Whitey Bulger. Later, his name would become synonymous with violence, but in 1957, he was an inmate serving time for armed robbery and hijacking, young, isolated, and watching the calendar the way prisoners do, as something that controls your future. He was approached with an offer that sounded clinical, a medical study, observation, data. The stated goal was research into schizophrenia. The incentive was good time, a reduction in sentence, a possible way forward. It was presented as voluntary. But prison rewrites what that word means. Saying yes meant cooperation. Saying no meant staying exactly where you were. Bulger agreed. What followed wasn't a single exposure, not a monitored trial. For 15 to 18 months, in repeated doses, often daily, he was given LSD inside an environment designed to remove escape, refusal, and privacy. This wasn't secrecy. This was erosion. There was no door to close behind him, no place to step away when it became overwhelming, no moment where participation could quietly end. Bulger later described paranoia, fear, and the sense that his thoughts were no longer his own, not as a sudden break, but as something that accumulated. Day after day, dose after dose. Whether this experience shaped who he later became is still debated, partly because it offers a clean explanation for an ugly outcome. But clean explanations aren't the point. The point is that the experiment didn't require deception. It required captivity. The U.S. government took a man who could not leave and turned confinement itself into a research condition. Different environments, different methods, the same doctrine. Operation Midnight Climax didn't survive for years because it was a perfect secret. It survived because it was a boring one. It lived inside the technical services staff, the gadgets side of the agency. A bureaucratic dodge. The perfect place to bury ethical questions in a department that wasn't expected to deal with human subjects. But even a black hole of oversight eventually attracts light. In 1963, the CIA's Inspector General, John Ehrman, began digging through files. He found receipts that made no sense. Liquor, high-end San Francisco rent, and special employees who looked remarkably like career criminals. His report was a double-edged indictment. He condemned the ethics, but he also condemned the competence. After years of dosing citizens, the agency had produced exactly zero scientific knowledge. No controls, no clinical follow-up. The research was just a collection of anecdotes recorded by a man sitting on a portable toilet behind a mirror. Ehrman warned that if the public ever found out, the reaction would be adverse. He was being careful with language. The public wouldn't be. He demanded closure. Gottlieb resisted. The safehouses didn't slam shut overnight, but the wind was changing. George White retired into quiet domesticity with his secrets, dying in 1975 of cirrhosis, just months before his world began to leak into the headlines. He never had to look Wayne Ritchie in the eye. The final act of Midnight Climax wasn't an arrest. It was erasure. By the early 1970s, the political weather had turned. Vietnam and Watergate had taught the public that government secrecy was often just a shroud for rot. Richard Helms could read the mood. He knew congressional attention was coming, and he knew MKUltra was institutional suicide. In 1973, he gave Gottlieb the order, destroy the files. They fed the operational records into shredders. They burned the names of the victims. For a moment, it worked. The program vanished on paper. But bureaucracy has its own kind of revenge: incompetence. They destroyed the case files, but they forgot the financial traces. In 1977, a Freedom of Information request uncovered a cache of 20,000 documents that had been misfiled in a different department. The scraps, the receipts, the money trail. Historians used those crumbs to reconstruct the outline of the crime. But paper isn't the only record. The body keeps the score. Operation Midnight Climax and the Atlanta experiments were two sides of the same coin. One looked like a party, the other looked like medicine. But both relied on the same lie: that some people don't matter. The program didn't just test drugs, it tested a doctrine and found it workable. In the next chapter, we move deeper into the institution. What happens when expendability is applied not to criminals or strangers, but to patients seeking help? We travel to the Allan Memorial Institute in Montreal, and we will meet the doctor who tried to wipe the human mind clean. Join us for Chapter 3, The Montreal Experiment. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. The Nuremberg Code. The CIA will later file this under Subproject 68. Montreal, March 1963. The air has that knife-edge cold that looks clean from a distance until you get close enough to see the city's winter grit. Snowbanks gone gray at the edges, dirty slush piled in corners, bare maples rattling their branches like dry bones. A heavy, dark sedan climbs the steep grade of Pine Avenue. Its tires hiss over wet asphalt where yesterday's snow is giving up. In the passenger seat sits Linda McDonald. She is 32, a mother of 5, and she is exhausted. Not the kind of tired a nap can fix, a crushing, months-long heaviness that makes every breath feel earned. At the wheel is her husband, Brian, wool suit, hands steady on the steering wheel. And between them, on the seat, rests a manila folder holding her fate. The car pauses at the steps. Above them looms the Allan Memorial Institute, Ravenscrag, a robber baron's mansion turned hospital, limestone and shadow, perched over the city like a warning. In this world, a husband doesn't simply bring his wife to a psychiatric hospital. He admits her. Brian gets out first, walks around to her door, offers a hand like this is a normal errand. He guides her up the stone steps and through the front doors, into the hush of old money scrubbed clean. At the reception desk, he signs the intake forms, watches black ink soak into white paper. And, with it, Linda's autonomy. Because the establishment has a name for her condition: chemically maladjusted. Brian isn't a villain. He isn't trying to discard his wife. He's a man of his era, trained in the cult of the expert. When an important man with diplomas and certainty tells you your wife's system is malfunctioning, you don't argue. You comply. You trust the science. A nurse appears, polite, crisp, efficient. Brian kisses Linda goodbye. He watches her pass through the inner entrance, the heavy door easing shut behind her, confident he's delivering her to the best care available. But Brian hasn't delivered his wife to safety. He has left her with Dr. Donald Ewen Cameron, a man who believes a cure begins by erasing the patient. Welcome back to the Fairshake Files. Tonight, we open the doors to Subproject 68. This is Chapter 3, The Montreal Experiment. If you walked into the Allan Memorial Institute, your first instinct wouldn't be fear. It would be intimidation. The sheer size does the work. The echo in the corridor when you don't mean to make noise. The air smells of floor wax and antiseptic, and the institutional hum of control. Outside those walls, Montreal keeps moving. Ravenscrag didn't exist in a vacuum. It was a McGill University teaching hospital. It sat at the top of a social order, close enough to watch the city, far enough not to answer to it. On St. Catherine Street, department store windows glow with mannequins in the latest Paris fashions. In diners, teenagers drink milkshakes and feed coins into jukeboxes. The churches are full. Montreal is known as the City of Saints, a place where the church spire is the highest point in every neighborhood, and the authority of the clergy is treated as natural law. At street level, life is loud, chaotic, and alive. Skate blades scrape backyard rinks. Bagels and smoked meat hang in the air. French and English collide on street corners, fast and automatic. But the higher you go, the noise fades. The houses get larger. The Golden Square Mile is where power lives. Stone walls, iron gates, and a kind of compound stillness. And at the top sits the Institute, physically separated, socially protected. This isolation is deliberate. It gives doctors a kind of autonomy you don't get in a busy downtown general hospital. Up here, rules don't apply in quite the same way. And inside those limestone walls, Linda is being processed. We look back at the early 1960s through a lens of aggressive nostalgia. Sleek new appliances, tail fins giving way to sharper lines, television families smiling through commercials, and the perfect nuclear home presented as a civic duty. But for women, it's a high-pressure performance. There's no vocabulary for postpartum depression, no respectable word for burnout. If a woman isn't happy in this post-war paradise, the culture doesn't question the system. It blames the woman. And that is how private despair becomes a psychiatric admission. As the heavy door eases shut behind Linda, she has one clear thought. If they can fix me, I can go home. The intake. The first 24 hours. This isn't just paperwork, it's a conversion. Before anything overt happens in a place like this, the system does something quieter. It relabels you. The first task is to strip away the person and reveal the patient. It starts with small, tactile indignities. Linda's clothes are taken away. The dress, the handbag, the shoes. The small things that say, I belong to myself. Jewelry is removed, pockets emptied, personal effects logged. She is issued a gown. This isn't just hygiene, it's leverage. Then comes the initial assessment. It isn't a conversation, it's categorization. Linda is asked about her function, her home, her temperament, her failures. Fatigue isn't treated like the predictable result of 5 children and sheer overload. It becomes a symptom with a name. The notes are written in a language she won't be allowed to see. Neurotic lassitude, passive dependent, anxiety reaction, schizoid tendencies. Linda doesn't enter this system as a human being. She is processed as a case number, a bed assignment, a diagnosis. And that relabeling is permission. Because once a person becomes a patient, the system inherits authority over what happens next. When they sleep, what they eat, whether they're lucid, whether they're believed. That power comes from removing normal cues, your wardrobe, your schedule, your privacy, and replacing them with compliance, rounds, orders, charts, protocols. In other words, the building isn't just a setting, it's a tool. And when something goes wrong behind those doors, it doesn't look like a crime. It looks like treatment. It looks like a difficult case. It looks like complications. For Linda, intake was only the beginning. The true engine of the experiment was the sleep room. This isn't a metaphor. It wasn't a ward with beds. It was a machine designed to dissolve time. Windows were fitted with heavy blackout curtains that were never opened. Day and night ceased to exist. The only light came from the dim glow of the nursing station in the hall. The Allan was good at silence. Not the peaceful kind. A designed hush. Airless calm. A place that doesn't want witnesses. The hallway floors were waxed until they gleamed. Rubber soles. Soft heels. No clacking. Noise makes people look up. Noise creates questions. The drapes were the real architecture. A sealed barrier between you and daylight. Heavy fabric swallowing the world outside. Montreal could be bright and brutally honest, but that room didn't accept honesty. Inside, the light was a permanent dusk. Patients didn't track time by sunlight. They tracked it by needles, by hands turning them, by the arrival of the tray. Time, in the sleep room, wasn't measured. It was administered. A medication regimen followed. Thorazine, Seconal, Nembutal, Veronal, 3 times a day. This lytic cocktail kept them in a state of chemical suspension for 20 to 22 hours. Some slept for 30 days, others for 60, one woman for 86. The word cocktail makes it sound social, something you choose. In the sleep room, that mix is not a choice. It's a schedule. Picture the cart. Rolling metal frame, drawers that stick, glass vials catching low light. A clipboard clipped to the top. Names, bed numbers, times. Not a life, just a list. Thorazine, the heavy coat. It dampened agitation, flattened expression, quieted physical resistance. The barbiturates, the trap door. If you tried to surface, the next dose pushed you down again. 20 to 22 hours asleep means you only get 2 hours awake to be a person. And those hours are not yours. You wake into a world with no edges. Mouth tastes like cotton. Limbs feel borrowed. Thoughts arrive late. Someone is already narrating your reality in a calm, professional voice. Good morning. Except it isn't morning. It's dose time. You're spoon-fed because chewing requires too much coordination. You're guided to the toilet because standing is a negotiation with gravity you can't win. You're turned in bed. You have become an object that must be maintained, less for comfort than for protocol. This is the part people miss when they hear coma therapy. It isn't sleep. It's suspended citizenship. After a normal night's rest, you wake with continuity, a memory of yesterday, an expectation of tomorrow. The sleep room breaks that chain. Days don't connect. Your identity can't hold shape when it can't hold time. And because it's medicine, everything is polite. The nurse smiles. The injection is clean. The chart is neat. The blanket is tucked. You slip under again. In this system, the body is a platform, and it's your consciousness they keep turning off and on until it stops returning the same person. Inside that room, the world comes unglued. You surface too heavy to move, fed thin slurry, dosed again. You don't know if it's Tuesday or Saturday, October or December, and watching over this void are the nurses. They practice what could be called microethics. They take pride in their care. They obsess over bed sores. They turn you every 2 hours with practiced rhythmic precision. Turn, check IV, smooth sheet, mark the chart. The charting is meticulous. Pulse, respiration, fluid intake. On paper, everything looks perfectly normal. The chart is a translation device. It takes something messy, a person dissolving, and converts it into columns that make sense to an institution. Pulse, stable. Respiration, even. Skin, intact. Mood, improved. Improved compared to what? Compared to screaming, compared to refusing, compared to remembering. Patient resting comfortably. It is one of the most dangerous sentences ever written, because it can mean comfort, and it can mean surrender. The staff rotate. New shifts, new hands. Fresh starch. Weekend plans. A child's cold. Life continues for everyone except the people under the blankets. A system that forces everyone to feel complicit collapses quickly. A system that lets everyone feel like a professional can run for years. Orders come down as casually as weather. Continue regimen. Increase dosage. Maintain sleep. Prepare for ECT. The language never says, erase her. The language says, treat her. Because a poorly run unit would look like a crime scene. A well-run unit looks efficient, controlled, clean. And the harm isn't legible enough to trigger instinct. No blood, no screaming once the drugs do their work. No visible bruise that can't be explained away as agitation. Just inert bodies, just tidy beds. Next comes ECT, inside Dr. Cameron's suite. Dr. Cameron's goal wasn't just to treat symptoms. He wanted to depattern the human personality. Standard ECT involved one shock, seizure, then rest. Cameron thought that was inefficient. He imported the Page-Russell method from Britain and intensified it. The machine triggered 6 times in rapid succession. Shock, pause. Shock, pause. Shock. And he did it twice a day for weeks. ECT is often described in abstract terms: a controlled seizure, a therapeutic intervention. Those words are for paper. They don't match the sound of wheels on tile as you're taken toward the machine. The ECT suite is a small geography of authority. The gurney, restraint straps, white enamel surfaces that never quite lose the smell of bleach. A steel tray with instruments arranged in a neat row, order as reassurance. The machine sits like a boxy altar. Dials, switches, cables coiled like black snakes. A nurse checks the connections with the calmness of someone plugging in a lamp. And then the patient is made ready. Another institutional trick. Coercion becomes preparation. Conductive gel applied, cold, sticky, intimate. The mouth protected because bodies bite down hard when the brain is forced into storm conditions. Limbs secured, not because the patient is dangerous, but because the seizure will throw the body into motion no one can control. Then the current comes. Shock. Pause. Shock. Pause. 6 triggers, 1 session, twice a day, for weeks. Memory is not a filing cabinet. It is a living process. It depends on continuity, on the brain's stitching yesterday into today. A seizure is an earthquake in that stitching. One seizure can blur the edges. Repeated seizures can tear the fabric. People wake up reset to an earlier version of themselves. They wake with missing skills, missing names. The simplest tasks become foreign. A fork becomes an object with rules they can't remember. A sentence becomes a puzzle. A familiar face becomes a stranger wearing someone else's smile. And then the patient is returned to the ward, and the ward pretends this is recovery. Patient disoriented, Patient tearful. Patient regressed. Regression is treated like a symptom. But in Cameron's theory, regression is the goal. The patient becomes dependent because she no longer has the cognitive tools to be independent. Help to dress, help to eat, help to remember her own address, help to remember the names of her children. In that dependent state, you can introduce phase 2. Because a person who doesn't know where they are can't defend who they are. Once the erasure was complete, the second phase began: psychic driving. This is often described loosely as brainwashing, but we need to look at the mechanics. It was an industrial process. It started in a recording studio in the basement of the Allan. Basement is the right word. Not lab, not clinic. Basement. Low ceiling, pipes overhead, the damp smell every old building carries. A small room lined with whatever soundproofing the era could manage. A microphone. A reel-to-reel machine with 2 spools turning like patient, indifferent eyes. This is where the mind was treated like tape. The staff weren't writing instructions. They were writing loops. Short phrases. Simple grammar. No nuance. Because nuance invites thought, and the point was to reach the mind after it had been stripped of its defenses. Sometimes the loop used Dr. Cameron's voice. Scottish brogue, clinical, flat, unrelenting. Someone had to operate the equipment. Hit record, rewind, label reels, bed 4, day 12, reel 3. Not dramatic work, meticulous work. And that procedural precision is what makes it modern. When you think brainwashing, you imagine a bright lamp and an interrogator. In Montreal, it can sound like a tape that never ends. The machine hums. The message begins. Over and over. And delivery matters. A speaker in a room can become background. Cameron's setup is designed to remove that option. The sound is close, intimate. It follows you into sleep and drags you back out of it. After enough hours, the message stops feeling like a voice in the room and starts feeling like the atmosphere. And because the patient is already exhausted, chemically dulled, cognitively damaged, the mind does what minds do when they can't fight. It adapts. Not with insight, with surrender. That's what coercion really is. It doesn't have to convince you. It just has to outlast you. The staff understood something modern advertising would later perfect. Repetition doesn't persuade. It occupies. The playback wasn't casual. Patients were fitted with modified football helmets with speakers built into the ear cups. Or, if they were too agitated, their heads were strapped between pillows with speakers embedded in the foam. The math of psychic driving is terrifying. The tape loops could run for 16 hours a day. One statement repeated every 10 seconds is 6 times a minute. That is 360 times an hour. That is 5,760 times a day. Over the course of treatment, a patient might hear the phrase, "You are a bad mother," nearly 500,000 times. This is not persuasion. It is auditory water torture. You cannot close your ears. The sound conducts through the bone of the skull. After days, the patient stops fighting. The voice on the tape replaces their inner monologue. The goal wasn't to convince them. It was to crowd out the self, until there was no room left for a name like Linda. Dr. D. Ewen Cameron, the director of the Allan Memorial Institute, was a titan of his field. First president of the World Psychiatric Association, president of both the American and Canadian Psychiatric Associations. By all accounts, the most powerful psychiatrist on the continent. But his history contained a dark irony. In 1945, Cameron sat in the courtroom at Nuremberg. He was sent to evaluate Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy. He listened to testimony about what happens when science is untethered from morality. He helped craft the Nuremberg Code. So how does a man who wrote the rules on consent come home and break them? Cameron possessed a specific kind of elite arrogance. He believed codes were for the protection of whole people. In his private journals, he categorized the mentally ill as statistically insignificant. This is the loophole. If you define a patient as a broken operating system rather than a human being, the code no longer applies. He didn't think he was a war criminal because his intent was progress. He viewed patients as clinical material, biological clay to be dismantled and remolded. And because of his status, no one questioned him. Who were you? A junior doctor? A nurse? A patient's husband? To question a man who had judged the Nazis. Authority compounds itself. Prestige becomes a shield that makes the horrific look like the cutting edge. Dr. Cameron wasn't a lone wolf. Systems are what enable cruelty. Inside the Allan, his most important lieutenant was Dr. Peter Roper. Roper brought military efficiency. A veteran of the Royal Air Force, he viewed psychiatry through a wartime lens. Mental illness was an enemy combatant. The patient was the terrain on which the battle was fought. He championed industrial psychiatry. If a soldier has shell shock, you patch him up and send him back to the front. If someone can no longer hold together the role expected of them, you don't coddle them. You fix the machinery and return them to their assigned place. He didn't see the violence as wrong. He saw it as necessary force. He carried that logic into the ward. The category changed. The method did not. This process wasn't confined to one kind of patient. It reached women and it reached men. And not all of them arrived in visible collapse. Some came through the doors voluntarily, looking for help, trusting that they were entering a hospital and not a program. What mattered was not gender. It was who had been judged suitable for intervention. Once they crossed that threshold, biography stopped mattering. Procedure took over. It was about breaking the self, regardless of status. While Cameron was treating patients, the CIA was watching. To them, Montreal wasn't a hospital. It was Subproject 68. The agency funneled money through a front organization with a delightfully boring name, the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. It sounds like a bird-watching club. It was a checkbook for torture. Grant number 68-1. Payments authorized in a drab office in New York, totaling roughly $60,000, over $600,000 today. The justification wasn't torture. It was the study of the effects of prolonged isolation and repetitive stimuli. But why Montreal? And why this technique? For years, the CIA was obsessed with LSD, flashy, sci-fi. But by 1957, intelligence planners were realizing a hard truth. LSD is unreliable. Dose a man, and he might tell you secrets. Or he might hallucinate that he is a dragon. Or he might just cry for 6 hours. They didn't want chaos. They wanted a switch. Cameron offered a mechanical process. Isolate, deprive, shock, reprogram. We know what they learned because we can set these methods beside the CIA's own interrogation doctrine. The overlap is unmistakable. Cameron wrote about regression, patients reduced to an infantile stage, dependent for basic needs. Later, the Kubark Manual, the CIA's internal interrogation handbook, describes induced regression. making the subject dependent on the interrogator for the satisfaction of all basic needs. Cameron wrote about removing spatial and temporal cues, disorientation, opening the patient to suggestion. Later, Kubark describes isolation disrupting the orderly sequence of thought, disorienting time and place, making the subject more yielding. This is why the language matters. The CIA didn't describe people the way people describe people. They used language designed to remove friction. They didn't say, a woman. They said, the subject. They didn't say, a breakdown. They said, ego dissolution. They didn't say, harm. They said, adverse reaction. Bureaucratic language is how institutions do things they don't want to feel. Under every clean phrase, there's a body on a bed. Back inside Ravenscrag, the schedule doesn't pause. The experiments ended, officially, in 1964. Cameron resigned. He died a few years later while hiking, arguably escaping the judgment he deserved. But for the patients, the experiment didn't end. It changed venues. They went home. For years, Linda McDonald was told her memory loss was just a symptom of her unstable mind. Her 5 children had to introduce themselves to her. She didn't remember their births. She didn't remember their names. Her children would later describe the uncanny part. She looked like their mother, but the recognition wasn't there, as if the person behind her eyes had been replaced. Imagine the scene. A mother returning to a house she doesn't recognize, to a husband who feels unfamiliar, to children who run to hug her, and she feels nothing. Not hate, just absence. This is the hidden tragedy. Families were forced to become caretakers of the ghosts Cameron created. Brian had to teach his wife how to be in her own life again. Show her wedding photos to prove they were married. Explain to the children why their mother looked at them with the blank stare of a stranger. And here's the part nobody puts in the file. It wasn't only Linda who lost years. Her children watched their mother disappear in real time. A house can be full of people and still feel like an empty room. Because the experts called the treatment a success, the families felt the failure must be theirs. So they tried harder. They got quieter. They stopped telling the story in public because the story sounded unbelievable. They lived in a silent suburban purgatory for 20 years, smiling for neighbors, collapsing in private. She had to learn to love them from scratch, learn to read again, learn how to cook, drive, be Linda. Not because she wanted a new life, because the old one had been erased. It wasn't until Velma Orlico began to pull the thread that the truth came out. Velma wasn't just any patient. She was the wife of David Orlico, a Canadian member of Parliament. She had leverage. When she sued the CIA in the early 1980s, the agency didn't apologize. They fought back. First, immunity. Then, Cameron as a rogue they couldn't control. Then, the research was useless and therefore not their responsibility. This is the second trauma: institutional gaslighting. After the treatment, you're told it wasn't real. After the harm, you're told it doesn't count. Canada commissioned the Cooper Report in 1986. It admitted government funding, then concluded the government wasn't legally liable because standards were different. A moral shrug. We paid for the gun, but we didn't pull the trigger. But survivors didn't stop. They forced a settlement in 1988. Linda McDonald received $100,000. Think about that number. $100,000 for the deletion of your entire life. For the loss of your children's childhoods. For the loss of who you were. It's not even an apology. It's a receipt. And that's the final cruelty. Money is the only dialect institutions trust. So survivors were forced to convert a human life into a number small enough to fit on a form. You can pay for pain. You cannot pay for time. The Montreal experiment was a failure of medicine, but it was a success for the intelligence community. They learned exactly what they wanted to know. The human mind is fragile. Remove a person's connection to time, light, and sound, and the ego collapses. But they also realized hospitals were too visible. Too many nurses. Too many records. Too many nosy family members. To perfect the unmaking of a person, they needed isolation the environment could provide. They began looking north, toward the cold and the dark. In our next chapter, we move from the clinical mansion into the tundra. We'll look at how Montreal's data became the blueprint for the Arctic mind, a secret ecosystem where the environment becomes the method. Join us for Chapter 4, The Arctic Mind. To make sure you don't miss our next investigation, please subscribe or follow the Fairshake Files on your favorite platform. Thank you for watching and listening.